Welcome, everybody. I think that most of you are here right now. I want to welcome you to Odyssey Bookstore. Is very excited to sponsor today's conversation between Becky Cooper and Don Mitchell. We are extremely excited to have both of them here with us in virtual space, and we were delighted to be partnering with Saddle Road Press in putting together this event. So thank you so much for joining us today. I'm just going to remind everybody to please, you will come into this meeting muted. Please keep yourself muted if you don't mind. If you'd like to see Don and Becky, make sure you have speaker view. And if you have any questions, please go ahead and put them in the chat. At the end of, we're going to have about a 40-minute conversation. And at the end, Don and Becky are going to be excited to take questions. I'll be reading your questions throughout, writing them down. And if we have a few too many, we'll be sort of sorting through them to see how that goes. With no further ado, I'm excited to introduce, sorry, I have to introduce and admit people. So excuse me if you see me going off to the side now and then. I'm going to start with Don Mitchell, born and raised in Hawaii, spent many years as an anthropologist among the Nagavisi people on Bougainville and as a professor in Buffalo. He also ran a race timing business and has been a marathoner and an ultra long distance walker, a landscape photographer and an award-winning writer. He's recently moved to Ithaca. His books include academic works on the Nagavisi, the short story collection, A Red Woman Was Crying, and now Shibai, Remembering Jane Britton's Murder. He has a BA from Stanford and a doctorate from Harvard, which is where he met Jane Britton, and the story begins. In Japanese culture, Shibai means drama or play, but in Hawaiian slang, it means smokescreen, bullshit, gaslighting. Don Mitchell weaves together the brutal 1969 murder of his friend, Harvard graduate student Jane Britton, harassment by law enforcement and the media, the language and culture of the Nagavisi people of Bougainville, the Big Island of Hawaii, the high barrens of its dormant volcano Mauna Kea, ultra running and walking, and the New York milieus of Buffalo and Ithaca. The unforgettable Jane Britton threads through the book, along with Becky Cooper, an investigative journalist, in whose book about Jane's murder, Mitchell is a continuing presence. Mitchell explores how memory and meaning shapeshift, the way facts can shatter long-held perceptions about oneself and others, and how love and connection transcend time and culture. Becky Cooper is a former New York editorial staff member and senior fellow at Brandeis's Schuster Institute for Investigative Reporting. We Keep the Dead Close, her second book, was supported by the Fund for Investigative Journalism and the International Women's Media Foundation's Howard G. Buffett Fund for Women Journalists. She is also the author of Mapping Manhattan, a love and sometimes hate story in Maps by 75 New Yorkers. We Keep the Dead Close is a memoir of mirrors, misogyny, and murder. It is at once a rumination on the violence and oppression that rules our revered institutions, a ghost story reflecting one woman's past onto another's present, and a love story for a girl who is lost to history. Becky, for the people who are joining us today who don't know the story yet, can you share a little bit about how you and Don met and how you got involved in each other's stories?
Absolutely. And thank you for that introduction, and thank you to Laura and to Don and his partner Ruth for organizing this event. It's really a special reunion. I think, boy, Jane's brother is in the audience, and perhaps Elizabeth Handler, her best friend from college, is too. And so the only thing I wish is that we were in the same room together so we could all kind of make this community real. But I'm grateful for this proxy. But back to your question, I first became aware of Jane Britton when I was a junior at Harvard in 2009. A friend told me a story about a young archaeology student at Harvard who had been bludgeoned in her apartment. And according to my friend, the person who had killed her was her advisor. There was a press blackout that was issued, and the press stopped writing and the police stopped talking. And for the next 40 years until I heard the story again, the case remained unsolved. And you know, his version of the story was obviously embroidered. It involved like hundreds of cigarettes burned into her torso. It involved red ochre, this red powder iron oxide that was spread, a burial ritual recreation with necklaces. But there was a part of the story that really remained with me. And I think, what it was that it had crafted a villain out of Harvard that I recognized. But still, it wasn't enough to kind of like shape shift my life around until about a year later, the story was corroborated by 2 other people within the department. And they said, well, the person that you're talking about, her advisor, he's still on faculty. And it was at that point that it really felt less like a fable, a kind of academic horror story, than it felt like an open secret that I really wanted to pay attention to and maybe be the one to take seriously. And so for the next 10 years, really on and off, I dedicated my life to trying to solve this question of who killed Jane Britton, and I watched as it shifted from that initial question to, among other things, who was Jane Britton? And over the course of trying to answer that, I was lucky enough to be entrusted with the stories and the memories of people in her community, not least Don Mitchell, who I first became aware of the night after the story was corroborated, or the night, in fact, that it was corroborated, when I started Googling, and I found out that Jane's friend and neighbor had been the person to discover Jane's body in her apartment, along with Jane's boyfriend at the time, Jim Humphreys. And it took me years first to get up the courage to reach out to Don, which I did in 2014. And then it took me 3 more years to convince him to talk to me. But it's been a pleasure ever since, really. And Don, ever since I first contacted you, even in 2014, I didn't know all that much about you, but I did know that you were trying to write something about Jane. And at that point, you had expressed it to me as a work of fiction. And Shibai is, among other things, a memoir and a true crime story at the same time. And, it weaves together so many different threads. It weaves together running and photography and your work with the Nagovisi and meditations on memory, and your reflections on Jane. And I guess I wanted to kick off your portion of it by asking you, how did you weave all these threads together? And how did you decide to structure it?
Well, I don't want to start without having a little fun about our meeting or not, because I think it's pretty funny. Becky got in touch with me and I blew her off because I thought, well, I don't know what she's up to. It probably has something to do with Jane. I was trying to write a novel about Jane, which wasn't going well. And then I said to her, and I meant it, I'll get in touch with you one of these days. 3 years later, or was it 2 years later? In any case, she called, and I talk about this in the book. I saw the area code. I thought it was my daughter-in-law. I picked it up, and there was Becky, who made so much sense so quickly that I realized, what was wrong with me? Why did I even think that I shouldn't cooperate with her? And in a very short time, as I said, she just convinced me that she was the real thing, which she is. And that was it. I said, all right, we'll go. I'm in. I think I might have even said literally, I'm in. And so from that point on, we began to talk to each other, and eventually we met in person when she came to Hilo. And that's continued up to the present day. But back to the book, I thought originally in the fall of 2017, just a few months after Becky had come to Hilo, and the detective, Sergeant Peter Sennett, was there too, which put a big scare into me, of which we'll probably end up talking more later. I thought on those 4 or 5 months and realized that I'd been in a whirlwind, in a whirlpool, in a storm. I was off balance. I didn't know what I knew. I didn't really know what was going on, who was doing Shibai. Were there some smoke screens happening? I didn't think anybody was lying, but is what seems to be happening really happening? And I thought, well, okay. I was going to the other side of the island one day for a meeting, which I also talk about in the book, of a group that I was associated with. And I took along my field recorder and I stuck a lavalier mic on my t-shirt and I drove across the big island of Hawaii talking constantly. And I just said, okay, I'm going to write about this. I'm going to write about this. And here are the people who are going to be in it. And I named them all, including Becky, of course. And having done that, I thought, well, okay, it's one thing to say I'm going to do this, but I better actually do it. So one day I fired up my favorite application, Scrivener, and opened up a page and started working. So that was the short version, which came to an end before the matter was sorted out. And when I wrote this one, I didn't know, I did believe in the fall of 2017, I believed that the DA's office in Massachusetts had in fact just been throwing up a smokescreen and were not investigating. I was completely wrong, but that's what I believed. And so I wrote something along those lines, you know, here is all the things, are all the things that happened, and I'm left with what? Nothing, I don't know anything. And then of course, that changed. And well, in 2020, actually, I didn't pick Shibai up again until last summer, actually July or August. And I thought, well, I'll see if I can make a longer version, especially now that we know what happened. So I tried one, I tried the other, you know, and eventually I thought this needs to be book length because I need to weave so many things together, as Becky said. And so I thought, well, I'll just do the things that have been with me for most of my life. You know, my field work, the people that I met there and I'm still in touch with, the murder itself, my own issues, concerns, uncertainties. And I thought that, well, Ruth Thompson of Southwood Press, who's actually my partner, she kept saying, you've got a spiral going here, you've got a spiral going here. And I realized, well, I do. So I began to think of it as if all these threads were a candelabra or a tree with branches, and I at the top. It was time to grab them, weave them all together and see what I could come up with. And so that's what I did. And I think it's, for people who haven't read it, perhaps it's a little unusual, but it gets to the end.
Do you experience structure viscerally? Just hearing you talk about it as a candelabra that you then kind of hold together.
I do. And let's see, I better not. There was a time when I was involved in running road race timing, and there was some events were very large, like tens of thousands of people. And there was always a time in prep when I would say to myself, I have it all in my head now. You know, all the things that had to happen, all the special cases. And then I would say, okay, I'm good. I got it all in my head. And that began to happen when I was writing Shibai. At one point, I finally said, I got it all in my head now. And so, yeah, it feels physical to me, as if it were a structure that I could put my hands on, even though I couldn't.
I also was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about Jane and your friendship with Jane, and then how maybe over the process of writing the book, perhaps it'd be fair to say your relationship to her, your understanding of her may have shifted.
Well, I met Jane when she was still an undergraduate, and became friends. As the cover of Becky's book is from a photographic session that I did with her in 1966. And she wanted to be photographed and I wanted to do it. So we did more than one session actually, but we did a lot of that sort of work. And I admired her for all the obvious reasons that if you read Becky's book. She was an extraordinary young woman. And we became friends. At the time, I was with the woman who would become my first wife, Jill Nash. And Jill was very taken with her too, as just about everybody was. In fact, when we got married, Jane played the organ at our wedding at a church down on the Cape. And Then she moved in next door in an apartment building. And at that point, we began to share our lives much more than we had before for some very practical reasons. We had a refrigerator that was very small and didn't work right. And the landlords gave her a nice new one. So you can imagine how that worked. We put everybody's food in Jane's refrigerator, and then we would go back and forth, taking what we needed out of it. So she was back and forth between her apartment and ours, and we were the same. Her cat was the offspring of our cat, so the cats went back and forth. And it was a nice set of connections that went on, well, really until she was killed. So let's see. What had struck me eventually was that Becky's knowledge of Jane became very detailed. And by, let's say, 2018 or so, I thought that Becky knew more about Jane than I did. I didn't think it, it's true, even though she had never met her. But Becky had spent so much time talking to her friends and reading Jane's letters that her brother Boyd gave her. That was a very interesting thing to me. When Becky told me that she typed the letters so as to get the feel of her doing them, I just went like, what an amazing thought, you know, to do something like, you don't just read them, you type them. And so I said to Becky not that long ago, over the course of the time that we've both been thinking about Jane, Becky's knowledge of Jane becomes deeper and deeper and broader, and mine remains approximately the same.
I don't know if that's fair. I think, well, I don't know if I would argue that I know Jane better than you. I think I know facts. I have a collage that other people have offered me, and I've put it together, and I've maybe made a scholar of myself out of it in a way that you haven't, but you know what she's like as a friend, and I will never know that. And I don't think I can overstate how important that is as a difference. But then secondly, I do think, just from talking to you, about the process of working on the book and the experience of, you didn't read my book until after you had finished yours, which I completely understand and admire the purity of, because you just need to know that this was the output that you were going to make, uninfiltrated by someone else's vision. But I do think at least your understanding of your own relationship with Jane has shifted over time. Like, that isn't a flat line.
Yes, it has. I think, though, I really go back a little bit to what I was saying about your book. I didn't begin to fully think of Jane in the world until fairly recently. I thought about Jane in terms of me and what I had done with her and what I thought of her, because really that's about all I had. I didn't know, for example, about her life as an illustrator. I knew very little. Some of those drawings that you showed me were extraordinary. I hadn't known about those. So yeah, the point is that I eventually began to locate Jane in her context and could see her there. But for me, I think really in my heart, it was almost nothing more than a loss that I never quite got over. And so there was that feeling, this wonderful woman was killed. I never had a chance to reach her potential. I know that's something that people say, but it would have been there was a lot of potential there. So I thought about her like that for almost 50 years. It was just a hole in my emotions, and Jane was there. I'm not sure I'm answering your question, but that I think at one point when I was working on Shibai and also working on a novel, I began to think that I had not put myself in her head, and that I needed to do so, and that it was going to be very difficult to do that. And so that was one of the understandings that I came to.
That makes a lot of sense. And I think it seems to me a legacy of having been trained as an anthropologist to talk about putting someone in their context, you know, and I think the legacy of that is everywhere in your book. You know, you're constantly, one of my favorite phrases in it is a kind of examination of what you call the contortions of the eye. You know, there's the you in 1969 remembering the events leading up to Jane's death. There's the you know, over those years, remembering that grieving period and experiencing it simultaneously. There's the you in 2014 when we met, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And like, there's this constant self-reflection in there over who gets to tell the story, what story is the true story, how do you relate to yourself over time as the story is also changing because of your shifting relationship to those memories. And I guess, you know, I wonder the extent to which your decision to put your book in the second person was also a relic of, or inconsistent with that training as an anthropologist, or was it something else?
I'm not sure it had to do with training as an anthropologist, but what I was trying to do, in case the people out there don't know, the whole book is written in the second person. You this, you that, you the other thing. I was looking for some distance, and also, although I don't think I said it to myself when I began, it became a kind of self-interrogation, as if I were saying to myself, why did you think that? Why did you do that? What did you miss? And I was, in a way, I think, distancing myself from the horror on some level of the murder. It was a murder, you know. Now it's important to keep that in mind, and the mystery of it. And I kept questioning my own interpretations, and I thought that was the best way to do it. I mean, sure, I could have done it in first person, but that just didn't feel right to me. So there's even a chapter called "You Decide to Write in Second Person," which is where I talk about these things. But yeah, it was all very, over the years that I was actively working on this, it was all very much a sense of what is going on here. And this was especially the case when you appeared on the scene, Becky, because you were finding out things, and some of them were things I knew or at least had an idea about, and some of the things were new to me, something that I hadn't known at all. And I remember very often sitting at my desk saying, what's going on here? Which is a strange thing to say when you're talking about a murder that's almost half a century old. What's going on here? No, what's going on there? But I kept thinking about it, what's going on in me? And that's part of the reason why I wanted to do that.
One thing I've been curious about through the years is, sorry, this is a conversation, but you're witnessing us falling into our natural patterns, which is me asking Don all the questions and happily listening. So Don, if you want to ask any questions, you're free, but I'm so happy doing this.
Well, let me do some of it, because it was pretty amusing. When Becky came to Hilo, and we spent, 5 or 6 days talking, well, it's not all we did, but we talked a lot. I was very struck by her abilities as an interviewer. And I could tell when she was not telling me things, which she should not have been telling me some of those things. She never said anything like, well, I'm not going to talk about that. She didn't have to. And when she probed, it was quite a wonderful probing, you know. She would just say things like, did you ever have another idea about that? or why did you think the thing that you've just told me? And in looking at the book, I'm changing the subject just a little bit. When I finally did look at the book, I was very amused to read about some of these conversations because there I was, as rendered by Becky Cooper, and accurately so. So I thought more than anything else that the book would be complicated, I guess is the word I'm looking for. It never occurred to me ever that your book, Becky, would be start in place A, end in place B. That never occurred to me. I knew better because as I got to know you, I knew you would never do anything like that because you too were gathering together all these strands, even though I didn't know how you were going to do it, but I knew you were going to do it. And I guess one of the things that I did know was not about the content of the book, but there were a number of times when you told me, well, I have found so-and-so, or I've got a pathway now that I can talk to so-and-so. So I was aware of that you were gathering information from a lot of different sources, but I didn't know how you were going to put them together. And, just skipping ahead a little bit, when I finally did read the book, perhaps the people out there will be amused. Becky gave me an advance review copy when I was still working on mine. So it was like my carrot. I said, there's no way I'm reading this. So Ruth had it. And it was sitting around the house. I could go out of my workroom and there's Becky's book, and I can't read it. I can't read it until I finish mine. So finally I finished mine and picked it up and read it in 2 settings. And I called Becky. I was going to text her and I, what do you got to call her about this? It's a big deal. I called her and I said, this is a wonderful book. And what struck me, apart from the fact that it is a great book, was that she and I had done the same kind of thing, a great many short chapters. My book is like 260 some odd pages. It has 55 chapters. Some of them are a page and a half. Some of them are 10 pages, but there are a lot of short chapters like that. And I wasn't prepared to open up Becky's book and see that she had decided that a way to tell the story was basically the same. Some very long and complicated chapters about things that she had found, and then some short ones. And I hopped around in time, she hopped around in time. We both use sometimes present tense, sometimes mostly past tense. All these things were delightful to me. That's the only word I can think of. I was just laughing in delight as I read your book and saying, this is a wonderful thing. Not that I ever thought it wouldn't be a good book, but it went beyond that to me. It was so much fun to read it.
Yeah, I mean, I was struck by that too, that, not having looked at each other's books, both of ours one of your blurbers call it, a meditation of, I'm gonna not get it exactly right, but something like aging, memory, and time. And you're also constantly questioning the accrual of significance to events and how do you know how do we know that this is the right one to tell? And I guess I'm curious what you ascribe the confluence of our not only like structure and storytelling methods, but also just the kind of thematic alignment of is it because we've been talking for so many years, or is there something inherent in this story that lends itself to this kind of meta analysis of the way time moves and of the way memory shapes things?
That's an interesting question. I do think that the structure, anytime you have an event, a situation where an event happened, and then there was a long hiatus in which nothing or almost nothing happened, and then there's a burst of activity in which it's all sorted out. I think it's inevitable that if we're writing about those things, it's going to end up being the same way. I mean, there wouldn't have been any point in spending any time talking about, say, roughly 1970 to 2017, because nothing much was happening. So I think in that sense, yeah. And the bursts for both of us, I think probably came from different places. Your bursts of knowledge came from new people that you were able to talk to, I think. And mine came more just from insights that I had or things that I remembered. Because I think we talked about this once, I was largely dependent on memory and you weren't. And I found out, and I'm changing the subject slightly here, I found out a few things about memory that those of you who are not old, you may encounter this when you get a little old, but one of them is that you forget things. So that's not even interesting because who doesn't forget things? But the other two things that struck me about memory were that one, having wrong memories, I don't want to call them false memories, but believing that something had happened and it didn't happen that way. And I wouldn't have had any way of knowing that, of course, until I heard from, until I saw Becky's book, or actually in the way it actually happened, until the fact checker, Samin Gauhar, asked me a few questions when she was being a fact checker. And you know, since she was asking me those questions, I thought, oh, okay, well, this is something that's in Becky's book. And I realized, well, I got that wrong, I guess. But then it all, as I have a part of a chapter, then it all turns to, well, maybe I didn't get it wrong. Maybe the police got it wrong. You know, maybe the stenographer transcribed the tapes wrong. Maybe there was noise. And, you know, once you enter that phase, you go down the rat hole, and I don't even know how you get out. The other memory thing, which I had to deal with on my own, but Becky at least was able to work with, is people who had encountered the same thing who came away with different memories of it. And then the question is, well, did I get this wrong? Did the other person get this wrong? There was an incident in which Jill Nash and I went into Jane's apartment to get clothes at her mother's request, to get clothes in which she would be buried. And even now, I remember how heartbreaking that was. It seemed strange and heartbreaking at the same time. We're going in here going through her dresser, finding clothes for her to be buried in. So that, for me, was a memory that has stayed with me all these years. But it would seem, from what Samin found out, that I'm the only one who has that memory. Now, that's interesting to me. And it's not the only time that kind of thing happened. So dealing with memory, apart from the way we all deal with it, do I remember that, do I remember that? The other thing, but trying to write about something is tricky. And having said that, I'm not sure what else to say about it.
I would just add, I guess, that I think that's part of why fragments worked for me, that like I was highlighting the kind of limited frames that I would get about any specific topic that, you know, memory would start in and cut out, and like, you know, I didn't necessarily always have context, or if I did, it was worthwhile sometimes to hold it for later in order to show the ways in which our own memories of events are limited, rather than trying to kind of patchwork it over. I wanted to kind of highlight that dramatically because that was so much of, you know, living with the story unsolved for 50 years. People were kind of siloed within their own islands of memory.
Well, I think you must have found with other people the same thing that you found with me, is that the initial conversations give you information and people are talking about things, but then a day later, 2 days later, a week later, a month later, I know I did this to you, and other people, wait a minute, I remember something more about this, or I'm not sure that I'm correct about this. Did you find that to be generally the case, that people?
I mean, yes. So the thing, I guess, that surprised me, one of the things that surprised me the most reading your book was that there's a passage in which I'm interviewing you, and you're trying to like gauge where I'm going and see if you can kind of answer the way that I might want it and see if you can kind of guess where I'm heading. And I had no agenda. Like there was zero hidden agenda for me trying to like angle you toward an answer I want. The only agenda that I had was to turn on the memory faucet, because once it's on, then everything else comes out. So it was like, I knew certain things that I wanted to ask you. I knew I wanted to ask you about your friendship with Jane, how you met, you know, what it was like hanging out with her, but like, and then, you know, grand jury and the day of finding her and whatnot. But, you know, there's no way I think that you'd remember necessarily, you know, the night that you had a party and drew on each other's bodies with markers, unless, you know, we were talking about the Beatles records that you'd buy at the Harvard Coop, and then that memory buys like going to Elsie's, and that buys going, and then eventually you end up with the markers. And so my only hope and my only plan there was to get answers to questions I didn't yet know to ask.
You must have, I mean, you had a tsunami of information. I don't know how you organized it. I mean, I know in a general way how you did, but to me, that's another difference between the way we wrote our books and the way that I had lived this. I remember saying to you, I've been in a bubble. And I didn't mean a bubble the way we use the term now, but what I meant was that since, for many years, I had had no new information about the case, none. And because of the life that I was living and where I was living and so on, I was not in contact with people who knew anything about the case, or rarely. And so I didn't have anybody to talk to about it, who would toss things, well, I remember this, or I remember that, or there was none of that. And then when you came, that was what led me to say, I haven't had any new information about this case for 40 years. And that was quite a surprise to me, thinking about myself. I realized, whoa, you know, you've been spinning around in a locked room, as far as this is concerned, for a great many years. And now, which I think one of the reasons that I was so pleased with our interactions, realized that the door's open now. You know, the door's open. Becky has opened a door in which I'm going to receive new information and work with it as I can. And then, of course, later on, Detective Senate opened a few doors for me too. And I learned things that I hadn't learned, and it widened my perspective. But it was a blossoming, in a way, a blossoming of information. And that was, I think that was when we were talking about structure. I think that was a part of it too, because I did see myself as, you know, I made a gesture like this when I was talking about a candelabra, but it's also true that I was feeling constricted, and then all of a sudden it was if perhaps the match had lit, or the Roman candle was going off, or the Bunsen burner went on, whatever you like, and all of a sudden many things became possible. Things to think about, things to write about, things to do. It was extraordinary.
I think we might have to switch to questions soon, but if I can ask one last question before we do, is have you given any thought to what you hope a reader will take away after reading your book?
I hope that a reader will, well, I'll say one obvious thing first, which is that a reader will understand that things like this are extraordinarily complex. And there is no such thing as the right answer or the straight answer. I think a lot of people know that in general about the world, but I hope that people will take away from it that it's possible to tap into a very large number of different sources of information. In this case, people in the far South Pacific that taught me things. That it's possible to use fiction in nonfiction, as I did. If you read the book, you'll see there are sometimes when it suited me to make a case by picking up something I had written some fiction that I had written years before and say, well, this says it better than anything I could say today. So I think that would be, and I'm not saying that facts don't matter or anything like that. I hope I'm not being misunderstood. But if the intent is to give a feeling, to give the concept of what went on for people to understand the whirlwind that I spoke of, then I think all techniques are on. Nothing's off the board. And that's what I tried to do. So, you know, I think if there's one takeaway, it's like, okay, this guy is in his mid-70s and all of a sudden his world blows up. Not in a bad way, it just blows up stuff. And what is that like? What is that like in the course of just a few months, that something you've been chewing on for 40 years, all of a sudden it goes like that, and it's extraordinary. So if I did succeed in giving that kind of feeling, then it was a success. And you want to take a shot at that, or do we have
What
to?
do I hope? I mean, I hope people walk away with a couple of things. One I think is a sense of Jane being real. I think it's hard to say, because one of the things I was most worried about was creating a kind of poor facsimile of who I believed her to be. And I think that's unavoidable to some respects, you know, in the line of biographer and historian's work. But I have tried really hard to go beyond, you know, not just saying, you know, she's not just a victim, she's not just a cipher, she's not just a symbol, but like, laugh at her jokes. Like, she felt more real to me for many years than other people, and partially probably because I was like locked in my room in Boston. But, you know, I hope that I've made my points viscerally in the book, that like Jane matters, that stories can be dangerous, and we need to be careful with the biases and assumptions that we have going into fitting facts into them. And so I've been heartened by like emails from readers saying, you know, I have walked away from this book and it has forced me to critically think about my own place in this world and the stories that I tell. That I hope that it kind of, I call it a kind of Trojan horse of true crime, where it blows up the genre from the inside. So that's my hope.
Well, I want to thank you both. I think we all found that fascinating. I could honestly sit here for another hour and watch you two, or longer, watch you two talk to each other. There are a few questions from participants, and if you've got more people, please feel free to add them to the chat, and I will read them as they come in. There were a couple comments about how much people enjoyed reading both of your books together, and how they really felt that kind of brought each one alive. But there is a question that says, could you talk about how your books would be different if the case was not solved toward the end of the writing period?
Well, actually, that was one of the things I thought Becky might talk about. My answer is quite simple. If the case had not been solved, I don't think I would have written this book. I would have stayed with the relatively short piece that ended with me in the fall of 2017 discouraged and thinking that, well, I've learned a bunch of stuff, but this is going nowhere and I'll never find out what happened. But Becky, I think, was in a situation where she must have had some idea of how she was going to wrap up this unknown business, and then had to redo it. But tell us about it.
Well, when I wrote the book proposal, I had guessed that the end would be a kind of meditation on why we desire certain stories, because I think it was going to take us through the same three suspects that the book goes through. And it was going to end with some kind of meditation on, I really don't think it's any of these three, and kind of wrap it up into a larger story about who we allow to be victims, how we limit them, who we want to be the villains, and how we limit them. But to be very honest, I didn't know if legally I could have done that, because without the exoneration that comes from a definitive answer, that it would perhaps have been too problematic to open all those doors without being able to definitively close any of them. And so, you know, I think my book already is, my agent and I refer to it as a kind of high wire act. And I had been worried throughout that I might not know how to get to the other side of that high wire without a solution. But I think because by that point, my commitment to the story was as much about getting to know Jane and a kind of sense of responsibility to her community, like you know, that wasn't the kind of central buzzing in my head. It was just keep going, one step farther. And if ultimately you can't, then at least, you know, you'll have tried. And that to me was preferable to not trying at all because it seemed so unlikely.
That's great, thank you.
Might I, as the surviving family member and a character in both books, thank for anybody else, both Becky and Don, for their commitment to this story, and to Peter Sennett of the Massachusetts State Police, and to an earlier writer, Susan Kelly of the Liz Connor Mysteries, if you're a mystery buff, who opened up some of the doors that led nowhere to a solution, but gave me something to think about for 50 years. Because the portrait of Jane done from research by Becky and from memory by Don is more complete than many of my memories, because a lot of the time when she was flourishing as an artist, musician, horsewoman, scholar, etc., I was goofing off or on the radio somewhere else, or in the army, or in Vietnam, or at Princeton, or someplace, and they knew her better than I in those days, and I was grateful for that portrait. Elizabeth Handler, of course, a close friend for many years, is the only one of those who knew Jane that I remained in contact with. And that, I think, was mere chance. But anyway, I want to thank them for what they did and give you the point, as a character in the book, I was treated fairly.
I'm glad you felt that way, Boyd.
Thank you so much for hopping on, Boyd. That was wonderful. Don, there's a question for you. How would you describe your emotional journey as you wrote this book?
Well, let me talk about something. Let me talk about fear, because that was a part of the emotional journey. When I knew that Peter Sennett was coming to get my DNA, I was afraid. And at first it was just a general fear, like, oh, they thought I might have done it in 1969 and now they think it again and they're gonna get me. You know, I thought they're gonna get me. Now, it didn't take too long, but not measured in minutes though, but measured in a few days when I realized, no, they're not gonna get you because you can't fake DNA very easily. And I began to think this would take a cooperation of a great many people in Massachusetts who said, let's get that Mitchell guy. and that's not something that could ever happen. So I put that aside. But the thing that troubled me emotionally for a long time was the same thing that had troubled me for almost all of those years, which is that, and I'll try to tell this as quickly as I can, that around the time of the murder, I was told by people who had a connection into the grand jury that the DA had tried to get the grand jury to indict me, but had failed. Now, I was told that. It turned out that that was not the case, but I carried that with me for a long time. And that was the source of the fear that I felt in that summer of 2017. What did the DA think he had on me? You know, what had I done that made, anyway, so I learned from Peter Sennett that that was false and that it had never happened. And the grand jury never got to that point. And I remember being in the interview room in the Gila police station, having just been told that somebody had falsely accused me of murder because I had said about the the DA's thing, and then that shocked me. And then 5 minutes later, I learned that the thing that had been used against me was actually false. And so that was the emotional journey, or let's say the rough part of the emotional journey. In the end, I think I could answer that by saying I'm quite calm now, especially when I finished the book. And if you read the book, walking, the last chapter is called Catwalk, when I went through the woods with my cat and talking into my phone. I mean, really, that's how it was. And I said, you know, when I got to the end of it, I thought, okay, it's over now. I've put this to rest. I've said goodbye to Jane. And indeed, that's what I feel. So now I'm calm. I mean, I miss her. I love her. She was a wonderful person, but I'm not ripped apart by that thing anymore. So how's that for you? I hope it's an answer.
I think that seems pretty good, Don. But this question is for Becky. Don, you touched on this a bit, but Becky, can you talk about how you decided on what order to put things in your book? There's a bit of a linear narrative, but it also jumps around. Did it depend on when and what info you were finding out? So again, I think that's for Becky, and then maybe Don, if you've got something to add.
Yes, so there were, I guess, different tiers of rules that I followed in order to figure out where information belonged. And I don't know if I've ever explained it like this, so it may or may not make sense. But I knew a couple of things. One was that I needed to introduce the case, and I needed to introduce myself and how I became involved with it. And so that was section 1. Section 2 is me becoming more involved with the research of it, learning how to become the kind of investigative journalist that it became apparent that I needed to be to solve the mystery. And at the same time, learning more about Jane, because, you know, while I happen upon that as thinking, you know, this is the starting place, it also made sense narratively to kind of open it up to understand who she was. And then the next four sections, 3, 4, 5, 6. Yeah, 4 sections are focusing on the 3 different suspects around whom I call them constellations of suspicion kind of accumulate, with one extra section thrown in where one of the suspects kind of pivots from a person to a symbol, and a kind of exploration of the ways in which that symbol operates within the cautionary myth that I believed Jane's story to have been elevated to within the anthropology community. And then the final section is, you know, the kind of denouement where you get the solution to the case, as well as the kind of expanding out of, even if villainy in the book is, it is not simply who killed Jane, but in fact this kind of, if my sense of the kind of cautionary tale is right, then it's not just silencing of one woman on one night, but this kind of systemic silencing of women in academia. So while the Jane story is kind of closing in on one particular person, the other part of that story is opening out. And so that was what I was trying to balance in the final section of the book. And then I think, you know, my part of the story pretty much follows myself chronologically. And I think the tricky bit for figuring out how to put in the information for the flashback scenes was I didn't want the reader to know more or too much more than my character did in any given moment in the text, because I think it was really important to me that readers learn alongside me and make mistakes alongside me and feel shame alongside me. And so I think the kind of doling or parsing out of information just followed, like, how am I honest about this while still recreating the experience that I need to have readers feel alongside me.
Thank you. That was very interesting. Okay, one last question. Don, your book is not about information so much as it is about the growth of the narrator, which puts your book squarely in the tradition of contemporary memoir. Would you say something about the narrator's progression, which I think is an interesting comment next to what you just said?
Pilgrim's Progress. That's actually quite hard to answer. I think I'll just say part of it would be, I'm going to say overcoming adversity, where adversity means something quite specific. I think one of the most important growth parts was when I was forced to realize, because of what Peter Sennett had found out, that the man I thought had killed my friend had not. And so I had to say to myself, you basically falsely accused somebody for almost half a century. And so I had to take responsibility for that. I had to deal with it, as we say. And that turned out to be not easy. I mean, it was confessional. And so part of the growth was that I think I now understand more than I did 2 years ago about, don't be so sure about things. Don't be so sure about things that might have a surprise in them or might be based on uncertainty. So I guess I've become more comfortable, or more, I should say, alert to uncertainty than I was before.
There's one final question that's come in for you, Don. Would you take a minute and talk about the different Shibai in your book?
Well, some of it is self-Shibai, let's say. If we go back to the Japanese definition of a play, of a drama, I came to realize that I had constructed my own drama about what had happened. I didn't see it that way. When I was thinking about Shibai, I was thinking about other people in the Hawaiian sense, confusing me or telling lies or dissembling. And I didn't see that the other meaning of it was right there in front of me, that I constructed this dramatic play with Jane and me and the other people in it. And I made something that I was comfortable in. I didn't have to question it necessarily. I didn't have to worry about anything. It was, so I performed a kind of Shibai on myself. So there's that. There's the dissembling. There's the, I hate the self thing, but the self Shibai, let's say. And then the classic thing. So yeah, I fooled myself. Other people fooled me, either because they meant to or because I thought they were doing it. But I also fooled myself. So that's why I thought it would be a good title. The smoke screens of the world that we live in.
Well, I'm going to join the final comment I see, and thank you both. I found that a fascinating conversation, and I think you've really given us an amazing opportunity to listen to you talk about really what is 2 books in conversation. I'll just say, do either of you have anything you'd like to say before we go? One last sort of comment for everybody?
Well, thanks to you, Laura. That's one of the things I want to say.
Wasn't fishing, but thank you.
Yeah,
but
I would say thank you to you all for watching too. And thank you, Boyd, for that cameo. That was very meaningful.
All right, well, I want to thank everybody for joining us. It was amazing, and I would like you all to know that please, as you can see on Don's shelf and ours, that we have both of these amazing books. We feel they should be read together, like a great wine pairing. A little cheese, a little wine, you know, they go together. If you come to our store, which you can look for information on our website when we will be available in person, but soon, both Don and Becky have graciously offered to get us autographed copies. So we're excited to share those with you. But thank you so much again, both of you, for this truly amazing opportunity. It was really wonderful to have you join us. And thank you, all of you, for joining us on a Sunday afternoon, wherever you are. So we wish you all the best in these days, and thank you both. I'm excited to go home and finish reading both books. I wish you all the best. Thank you so much.